I'd like to welcome everyone to our session today. This is session 4 of Valora's Universal AutoClassification MasterClass webinar series, again, with a focus on managing ROT and migration. So this entire webinar series runs throughout 2019, and each session serves as a deep dive into each of these areas where organizations most often face challenges. So what it is, where to start, how to approach them, and then best practices in these various aspects of an overall organization's IG strategy. So if you've missed the first 3 sessions, you can view them on demand on our website at valoratech.com. And if you haven't yet registered for future sessions, then I encourage you to do so again by visiting our website. So next slide then. So now let's meet our speakers. So if you have attended a Valora webinar before, you are very familiar with Sandy Serkes. Sandy is CEO of Valora Technologies, and her background includes over 20 years experience in entrepreneurship, management, corporate strategy, with a focus on IG, predictive analytics, document data mining, and processing and speech recognition. She is an accomplished speaker and panelist in the IG industry, a graduate of Harvard Business School and MIT, and also serves as a professor at the Columbia University School of Professional Studies. And joining us today, our special guest, we've got Nick Inglis, is Executive Director of Content and Programming at ARMA International and formerly President of the Information Coalition before the 2 orgs merged. Nick is a published author, and his writings on information leadership and strategy and information management have been featured in a number of high-profile publications. Previously, he served as Director of Professional Development at AIM and was also one of the youngest Assistant Vice Presidents in Bank of America's history, which I found very interesting. He also has more certificates and certifications in IG than I have time to name here, but suffice to say, we're very glad to have you join us today for today's webinar and share your perspective with us and our audience. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Sandy to start the webinar.
Okay. Welcome, Nick, and thank you, Jen, and hello to everybody out there. I know some of you are probably on your repeat webinar attendance, so thank you for that. You're going to hear some callback things today. But basically, this is what we're going to cover with ROT and migration as our theme. Yes, everybody knows what ROT stands for, but what is really happening with that? Where does it come from? Why doesn't it go away? Why is ROT so hard to manage? And then where does ROT fit in the larger information governance picture? ROT is just a piece of the puzzle, but it's kind of a critical one. And then, of course, it wouldn't be a Sandy conversation without auto-classification being mentioned. So we're going to talk about how to use that technology to manage ROT, not just today, but ongoing in an evergreen manner. And then we're going to kind of ease on into content migration, since that's a hot topic, and ROT is of course related to it, and the larger picture of migration, which I tend to call data in flight. So we'll get into that. And then I'm going to do something a little bit different this time. Usually I end up my sessions with some case studies. This time I'm just going to kind of sprinkle them throughout when the topic is relevant. And we also have the benefit of Nick with us, so he can talk about organizations and situations that he has seen too. So that's our plan. It's a lot to get through naturally, so let's dive in. Okay, I've asked Nick to kind of kick us off because his role at ARMA is specifically around content and programming, and it's his job to kind of oversee research and oversee educational content, and he's so naturally very good at it, Nick, from his years at Info Coalition. And so I wanted him to share kind of the Nick/ARMA worldview with you all. So I'm going to shut up and let Nick set the stage for us.
Well, I appreciate that, Sandy. My goal here is to really help frame the discussion with some data underlying how we got to where we are today. So this is from some research that I did back in 2017 with the Info Coalition, now a part of ARMA. And I find this stat really just absolutely shocking still. And I don't know that over the past 2 years since this research was performed, if we've really moved that needle at all. So nearly 2/3 of organizations believe that their information architectures aren't effective. So the structures underlying our information and the classification and the organization of that information is not effective in any way, shape, or form for about 2/3 of companies. So only a third of organizations today feel like they have their information organized in a way that's actually useful for their organization. I want to go to the next one here. Um, this one always shocks me. Information as an asset. So nearly one half don't think that their companies treat information as an organizational asset. And this is one that I just find appalling, because if we look at the value that information gives to an organization, information really is our lifeblood. It's our IP. I always say that if you're not treating your information as an asset as an equivalent of our financial assets of an organization, we're really doing ourselves a disservice. The information that your organization holds and manages and governs has incredible value, and you can see that value from the flip side of it. When some of this information is leaked or breached or made public, that's a significant challenge for that organization. Likewise, the information being retained and managed and usable by the organization has tremendous value, and we often underestimate that value. So another one is, how strongly are our company systems connected? What we continue to find time after time as we research this topic is that most organizations have very little connection between their various systems. When we dig into this further, there's different different classification structures in our different systems, and frankly, the shared drive ends up being a place of last resort to put information. So we continue to find around 80% of organizations say that their systems are disconnected, which creates silos of information, which makes that information less usable to the organization, which inhibits our ability to drive efficiency, and so many other challenges that we're going to discuss here. Here's some more research that I did in 2017. Only 15% of companies say that their information is easy to find. That's a huge challenge. If we move beyond just the information architecture being effective, but findability of the information within that information architecture, that number skirts down all the way to 15%. So it's a bleak picture that I'm painting, but I think that there are ways that we can improve this through advanced technology and better structure. We'll end up talking about all of that here. Some credit to AIM. They did some really great research on this front. 61% of companies have over half of their content in non-ECM systems. And when you dig into that, it's really non-managed systems, whether we're talking about ECM or IM or records management. Over 50% of their information is in a format that is unusable, essentially. So as we're talking about rot, if over 50% of our information is in these non-ECM systems, that poses some real significant challenges. One where we need to look to advanced technologies to help us get ourselves out of this hole that the pace of information growth has really put us in. So I point to shared drives as a real source of nightmare, headache, risk, and it's because a significant amount of our information exists within shared drives. Based on that research from AIM and research that we've been doing at ARMA and the Information Coalition, we continue to call out this fact. Much of our non-classified content exists within shared drives. And I say non-classified, oftentimes there are some classification schemes that are on our shared drives, but they're so ad hoc that they're unusable. Things like Mike's folder often exist in these shared drives. And you look back and no one even knows who Mike is at this point. that's not an uncommon occurrence in organizations today. And those shared drives present significant problems because they have no organization or structure, no real enterprise level organization or structure within them. They also have no oversight. It's not as though there are limitations on our shared drives in any way, shape, or form. People, it's what I often refer to as the wild, wild west. People can do what they want with information, and that can be information that can pose significant risk to your organization, including personally identifiable information, and poses a significant security concern. There's also minimal findability. So as you enter information into your shared drives, findability is often based off of file name, and since there are no naming conventions or structures in place, that means findability is reduced pretty drastically in shared drives. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one. As I said before, I like to refer to it as a cesspool of risk, because you don't know what's in there. You don't know what risk is presented by your shared drives until you actually look at it. So as we're looking at ROT, redundant, outdated, and trivial information, we should also, I think you have this as a topic at another webinar, but also look at this as a risk, a potential source of risk to your organization, that this information is available. There is no information access controls or minimal information access controls on the information that exists in here, and it poses a significant risk to your organization.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, it's a bleak picture that you have painted, but we're here to save the day. So everybody cheer up. Here comes Sandy with some auto classification solutions for you.
We need a bright spot here, Sandy.
Yes. Okay. So here I come. So one of the things that I have put together actually since the last round of this Universal Auto Classification series, which was last one was in May, was I've been asked by a lot of our clients and partners to kind of define in an easy way what is information governance. So I have put this together as the 8 pillars. You will, of course, recognize, these terms, and we're going to talk about 2 of them today. We've already covered a bunch on our previous sessions, and we're going to cover the rest in the rest of the year. So this seemed like a perfect time to kind of take stock and say, all right, what are we really talking about? So these are the topic areas. Today, we're going to cover ROT and data in flight, but this is sort of, if you're struggling in your organizations to explain to people what you're talking about, this is kind of a nice summary way to do it. And so now let's get into ROT as one of the main pillars of information governance. So as Nick said, as you all know, redundant, obsolete, trivial. And I know there's kind of this argument whether it's obsolete or outdated. It's basically the same concept, which is this kind of material. And there is a difference between redundant, obsolete, and trivial. We're going to get into that because if you're looking at your information at just the highest levels, like a custodian or a folder level, or maybe even just a share drive or an archive, you have very, very little information to actually go on. And one of the things that auto classification really brings to the table is to make the sort of unseen seen. So allows you to understand what exactly is that content without having to sift through it manually yourself. So that allows you to get much more granular in your definition of ROT. So you'll see that. So for example, there's sort of wholesale ROT, like a litigation database for a case matter that has settled. Then that entire database is basically redundant at this point and should be defensively deleted. Okay. Email boxes for people who left your organization 15 years ago, redundant, probably obsolete as well. Okay, other things that are obsolete, where obsolescence starts to play a role, is based on what makes it obsolete. And you'll see that I have one of these in brackets because I want to talk about that. We're going to come back to that one in a minute. Just because someone hasn't accessed something, that's sort of the weakest way to determine time period A far better one, and the records folks know this, is to have a retention policy or a retention schedule that says we will keep this kind of content for this kind of duration. And then once it has reached its useful limit, we will defensively remove it. Okay, so obsolescence brings in the idea of time and the passage of time. That's why you see things like versioning and temp files showing up in the obsolescence corner. And then there's everybody's favorite, trivial, the actual junk. Spam is the best example of trivial, but there are plenty of others. So for example, what's a low value document? An out of office reply, or a slip sheet, or a sequence of them that is used to just kind of demark something but doesn't have any value in it itself, or a template that's used or was used 10 years ago. Things like that don't have any actual meat to them are what we mean by a low value document. Personal content, like it or not, our work lives and our personal lives have merged, and that shows up as having work stuff at home and home stuff at work. And so, I can tell you as an auto classification provider, we are constantly running into your personal content all over the place. Photos, car manuals, recipes, you name it, it's in there. It really doesn't belong in there in the first place, and it certainly shouldn't be the responsibility of the organization, because once data is within its purview, then it is its responsibility. So rot has a lot of nuance to it. And again, the more you can get into the detail of the content, the more nuanced you can get in your assessment of is it rot or is it not. So I will just stop for the moment. And Jen, I didn't know if any questions had come up all during Nick's part or this sort of introduction to rot.
No, we're good for questions right now.
Okay, I will press on. Okay, so what's the big deal? So we're keeping rot. Storage is cheap. What the hey? There is real risk to doing this. The easiest kind of pain in storing and having all of this rot is, of course, the expense. And that little second bullet over there also comes from AIM. Just kind of indicates what it looks like, for a large company with 10 petabytes, which, by the way, worldwide for a global, multinational organization is bupkis. This is what they are spending on storage, whether either it's behind the firewall where you're supplying your own infrastructure, or it's up in the cloud where you're paying that, right on over to Azure or Google, who are happy to take your hosted gigabytes money. So, the first massive implication of over storing is the cost. The second is the lost productivity. And we touched on this in one of our other sessions. We had a whole lot of research from IDC and others about what is the cost of lost productivity. Here's a very nice summary, which basically we're all losing 2.5 hours every single day. To the fact that there's so much extra goo in the way that we have to wade through just to find what we're looking for, if we find it at all, per Nick's earlier point. And then finally, I know some legal folks on the call, you all know what the concern is in keeping things beyond their useful life, which is that if you have it, it's discoverable, period. And I've said this before, if you're in violation of your own retention policy because you can't throw anything away for whatever reason, then even more perilous to go into the court to say, well, it was discoverable, I kept it, therefore it's fair game, and I violated my own policy. That is going to set you right up for sanctions. So there are all kinds of costs and pain implications. And Nick, I thought I'd ask you, do you have any kind of horror stories from your career in this business of an organization that felt the pain of rot?
I've seen everything in organizations, from a major organization uncovering the entire library of Led Zeppelin live recordings that they were paying for on a shared drive space.
Which was probably violating some sort of intellectual property as well.
Yeah, that one was a humorous, but also presents risks to the organization that they may not have been aware of. But also, they were paying significant amounts of money for hundreds of gigabytes of live recordings in high fidelity recording format. But I've also seen organizations where they put client logs into their shared drive, and those ended up getting shared out publicly because an employee decided that they wanted to take action against their employer. So we always like to underestimate the potential risk of this things that we consider rot that may actually have incredible risk. But because we haven't ever looked at or identified those pieces of information that exist in that space, we really don't know what the risk that could be presented is. And until we can identify that risk, it's really hard to make decisions around it.
It's a really good point. I think the days of I don't know being an answer have ended. It is our responsibility to know what is inside our organizations, and regulation like legislation like GDPR have made that excessively clear. It is not acceptable. It is not permitted to not know what you have.
It's also there's a question of consistency in the management of your information. What opposing counsel, and I'm sure the folks from the legal industry that are on this call would also attest to this, what opposing counsel will often do is try to find inconsistencies in your management or governance of your information, so that they can say that, well, you're not treating this information consistently. And when you're not treating it consistently, you're at risk for the judge simply ruling against you. Because there's a lack of consistency, you often are simply found at fault. And one area where there's absolute lack of consistency between your policy and reality, it's the shared drive and what may be lurking in there. Also, your email boxes. I think you went through the list in that last slide of
Exactly.
the potential locations.
Right. So you queued up the slide perfectly. I mean, basically, rot is not something that happened to us accidentally. And this is something I want to stress. Rot is a byproduct of us living our professional lives. And so we should account for it, expect it, and anticipate it. So I kind of view it as like the orange peels, right? You can't get at the delicious orange, or you can't have orange juice without having to somehow manage the accumulation of the peel that you're not going to use. So rot, we haven't really dealt with this too well so far, so it has accumulated into a big back file, but it is also being generated every single day. Every time we transact business, every time someone is out of the office, every time there's a business closure due to a storm or what have you, rot is going to continue to come up. So this is yet another pin in the dartboard of why information governance is an ongoing evergreen activity. Even something as simple as taking out the trash, right? You know this from living your lives. You don't get to take out the trash once. You take it out every week because you accumulated more. And so identifying rot, clearing it out, and then being able to anticipate that activity over and over and over is really what we're trying to solve with auto classification. It's really not just a one shot. So I mentioned earlier that obsolescence, of course, has the notion of time and the progression of time. And I know that there are organizations out there that think they've got this down because they set up essentially an automatic timer, and let's say for email, and every 90 days we wipe the email unless you've moved it into a folder. One, beware of the unintended consequences of that activity. If you just go ahead and willy-nilly delete people's emails, they will revolt on you. And two, all you are doing is incenting them to make a black market inbox And that's why people start copying emails into Word format, which, yes, I did this morning. Thank you very much. And essentially keeping a shadow version of content. So I have some very strong feelings about time-based, completely blind, just purely time-based handling of data. That is not the right way to handle rot, and I will show you. So here are two emails, okay? Literally, the one on the left, which is clearly spam, came straight out of my email box. You can see that I am the recipient, even though I have 97 million filters. And so this, first of all, should not be saved for 90 days. This should be gotten rid of instantly, and yet it got through every firewall that we have implemented at Valora, and believe me, it's a lot. And yet it got through, and it's probably still in my inbox because we do not use an automated time deletion. And so this, if you are using an automated time, it's going to sit there for 90 days, cluttering up space, you're paying for the hosting, etc. That should be eliminated instantly. Then you have the flip side. This is a pretty critical email. It contains a signed contract in it. All right. You could consider that a record, or maybe just the contract is a record. The point is, this is an important email. And just because day 91 has arrived, you should not just throw this baby out with the bathwater. So there are better ways to handle the aging of content or the content life cycle than time in a vacuum. You haven't accessed these in a long time either. A little shout out to you Gen Xers out there who can recognize the yearbook from our time frame. You haven't accessed these in a long time either, but it doesn't mean you just throw them out because time has passed and your last access date on your wedding dress may have been, 15 years ago. You don't just throw it out. The actual nature of the item, what we would refer to now as content analytics, makes the difference on whether you keep something or whether you don't in the context of time. Okay. So I want to do a bit of a deep dive on duplicates because duplicates are by and large widely viewed as the single worst offenders of rot because we're all keeping everything multiple times, and I'm keeping it and you're keeping it, she's keeping it. One of the biggest offenders, of course, is email, right? If I sent an email to everybody on the webinar today, it would be in my outbox and all of your inboxes. And so if we were all in the same organization, there'd be 52 copies of this same document that I attached to my email. And so duplicates are the perpetual nightmare of content management. So I wanted to kind of dive in and show you, first of all, what kinds of duplicates there are, and second of all, how to treat them. So there are three kinds of duplicates out in the world. There are exact duplicates, what we call forensically identical. And what that means is they're hash values, which is an algorithm for essentially making a unique digital fingerprint for a piece of content. When the hash values match, it's like a DNA match, then you have an exactly duplicate file. So if I send the same Word attachment to all of you, those will hash value match. eDiscovery folks recognize this because they use that to call out data in a discovery database. But out in the actual universe, in the real world, they're all over the place, in particular because people copy files from one place to another. Every time you do that, you're making a clone, an exact duplicate. A 99% duplicate, what we call a functionally identical, is something that is, for all intents and purposes, identical, but does not hash match. The number one example, you have a file, a Word file, PowerPoint, and then you save it as a PDF. Those will not hash match, but they are functionally identical. And then we have near duplicates, which is content that's similar, but definitely not identical, but they might be similar enough that you want to kind of view them or know about them in the context of the group of them, like a set of revisions to a document or a form letter that goes out to all of your customers. The actual recipient is different, but the rest of it is the same. So there are different lenses or facets by which you would want to understand that content in context of the other similar files. So let's take a look at an example. This is a file that I made the other night. It's a Word document in Origin, and then all I did was save it as a PDF, the world's most standard thing. First of all, look at the difference in size. So right there, they're not going to hash match, obviously. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to show it to you. Yes, continue, please. Oh, for God's sake, it worked earlier. That's because I copied it down. We will fix it for you when we send it out. This is legit. I had to launch it locally instead of at Valora, and so I didn't bring the files with me. But they are the same exact file. One is I made one seconds later than the other, and of course they don't match at all. They're a great example of this 99% duplicate, functionally identical content. And the reason you want to know all of these is because they may affect whether or not you delete them. Basically, how are you going to treat this content? If you have 45,000 exact duplicates, I think you're going to be pretty comfortable removing a bunch. If you have functionally identical, some choices come up. Which one do you save, the Word or the PDF? Or do you save both? And then in near duplicates, usually it's not about deletion, but more about organization and control and findability when you go to search. So again, you can see us getting more granular and content oriented in the disposition and handling of files. So let's look at some rot examples, just in case anybody's still confused. What do you mean by rot? Here are perfect examples. Here's an attachment, here's an email, right? This one's essentially a Christmas card. This one's an out of office. These are not worth keeping and cluttering up your file shares. And so now let's talk about how does classification solve or help this problem. First of all, you can do it the hard way or the easy way. So the hard way is basically, and there are many organizations that would have you do this, entering metadata by hand to say, okay, here's what this is, here are some keywords or tags, here's the kind of security it should have or the retention it should have. And that requires every person doing that to be an expert in all things content, all things records, and all things retention. Good luck with that. What we have found by and large is that that does not work. And what people do is take the easiest way out. They say, yeah, same as last, regardless of what it is. Or they just hit A going down. One of the horror stories that we've seen is that a client's database had an option and they required people to enter metadata for what vertical industry the content was related to. And every single thing they had was related to agriculture because it was the first one on the list. A. So this is the hard way. This is the easy way, is to use technology, to use software to go ahead and interpret the text. I'm not going to go all through this like I have in past sessions, to essentially go through the text, create a set of field data or metadata tags, and then use those tags to provide a rules-based or weighted disposition schema. So that is the easy way. This one requires each person to do it by hand and to be an expert. This is centralized, essentially seamless to users, and it's just done for them on their behalf. Kind of like when you go into the library, things are already classified and stored. Same idea.
A note on that, Sandy. We had some research a few years back that looked at the success rates of humans entering metadata, and frankly, it was absolutely appalling. At this point, systems do a significantly better job than us trying to force classification on our users. It just is less effective.
Yes, and there's also a sort of a significant passing of the buck in terms of risk that I don't think really flies if it ever comes to a court of law. And that's where I want to talk about top-down versus bottom-up. There are definitely two schools of thought still out there, although the second one is gaining ground. The top-down approach, which is that someone will determine what record types are and essentially shove it onto the staff. And so that the onus goes on to the department or the employee to sit there and classify content, which is a thankless, awful job. And so what is happening there is the company is kind of skirting the issue and making people sign affidavits, and the records managers are nodding their head right now and saying, yes, yes, I read all the documentation. Yes, yes, I will abide by these rules, and yes, I've totally done so in exactly the amount of time you told me to do so. When the reality is quite different. And this is really just a feel-good, fool yourself type of setup. If it ever did come into a court of law, it would be shot apart in 5 seconds by folks like Nick or me, who are experts and will say there's no way that, Joe Bob employee is somehow an expert in records. And so we have the contrasting view, which is really gaining ground as these tools and these capabilities come to market that let you literally know what the content is, like AutoClassification, which is going to go from the bottom up, from the content point of view, as opposed to from the top-down kind of administrative point of view. And so what happens here is a rules design and classification related to content type or content scenarios, where the onus goes on to the experts where it should be, either the centralized IG team or legal. And so those are the folks that are qualified to make such decisions and on behalf of the organization. And so what you have here is a much more content oriented or managed by metadata type of approach. And in fact, just a plug, that is the name of our session for session 5, the one that's coming, which is how to really run IG by content and metadata management. So you can kind of see the beginnings of that here. This type of technique will supplant the top one. It can inherit everything that's here. Those policies, the rules, the instruction sets can all be inherited in the green bottom up, but take the onus off of the individual. So here's what it looks like to actually auto-classify ROT. So remember this guy. What an auto-classification engine does is essentially get to the text, and there's not a whole lot of text on this, but there is a little bit and enough to make the distinction. So here's what it does. It sees text and finds words like Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, It's a Boy, Mazel Tov, So Sad to Hear. And those are what we'd call a watch list. They're indicators that it's probably not a lot of business or regulatory value to the content. We do look at time, but time within context. Time of an email versus time of a PowerPoint, or time, the date related to the words Merry Christmas. That kind of makes this time frame, which is nearly 5 years ago already, ever more obsolete. We look at things like what I call the signal to noise, how much content versus graphics, how many identical or similar copies are out there. And so then the implied status is that this is junk, and it can safely be defensively deleted. If you're nervous about it, safely delete 3,999 and leave 1 and add 3,999 pointers. That will cost you a lot less. We've got a couple other ROT examples, and then Nick, I'll ask you for some of your favorites. So here's another one. This is an example of what I would call honest ROT. This also comes straight out of Valora. All these examples are literally out of Valora emails. And so this is a typical, kind of afternoon update blast that goes out every single day from your favorite, publication or blog or whatever it is. And again, well-meaning, useful, maybe in the moment, but this is from 2017. There's no reason for this to still be around unless something about this content is especially on point. See what auto-classification can do for you? It can give you that kind of weighting of, it's not just ROT, it's sort of how badly is it ROT, and is there anything in there that says it should be kept or immediately dismissed? Maybe there's something offensive in here, it should be immediately dismissed. Same idea. And here's the one I showed you earlier, same thing. Lots of things that you can do that possibly not everybody in your organization would even think of, like a suspicious sender. Okay, so Nick, any kind of ROT or ROT auto-classification examples that you think would fit the bill here?
I like the one that is a spam email that made it through the filters and had a virus as an attachment.
Oof.
And was just, there was a time-based retention system that automatically took the email, put it into corporate systems for safekeeping, and basically unleashed that virus that was in the email on their corporate systems. Because that was it was a trivial email. It was something that should have been picked up on an evergreen basis, as you like to say. But it ended up unleashing a worm into that, not a small organization by any means, on their server, which was not their server space. It was cloud-based. But it was not segregated from the rest of their information in any way, shape, or form, and they ended up losing access. They ended up releasing some of that information out into the wild because a hacker used that as a door into their corporate systems.
Yeah.
So there are real world implications of this. We're looking at spam emails, some newsletters. But there are greater risks that exist here as well. These are just the ones that take up the biggest space and end up saving you a lot of money. But from a risk perspective, there are other greater risks here as well to your organization if you do this improperly.
I really like that example, Nick. Thank you for sharing it, because it is the first time that I've heard of a virus specifically exploiting the best practices as they may have stood at the time of records retention. And that's, that one hurts. So thank you for sharing that. So, okay, so how does auto-classification help? Obviously, it can identify what the content is, whether or not it's rot, to what degree it's rot, when you might want to keep it or delete it or sequester it or whatever you're going to do. So basically, what auto-classification does is take the guesswork out of the content. The what is this part of the equation can very easily be solved, as well as the, okay, I understand what this is, what should I do with it? That's that rules-based disposition. We've talked about that many times, so I'm not going to go into the details. But what it does, first of all, is take the burden off of the individuals in the organization and put it back in the hands of the information governance folks where it belongs. And therefore, take the inconsistencies in the guesswork and all of that kind of finagling that people do, get that off the table. What it also does is open the door to all kinds of content-based disposition. So you can start to have things like links and tombstones. If you don't know what a tombstone is, it's like a shortcut. It looks like a file that you can launch, and to the end user, it looks and feels the same, but it isn't actually there. It's just like a little marker or pointer to where the file lives. So in that example of 4,000 copies, you can just keep one, and the other 3,999 are just like a little shadow, basically. So that's how tombstones work. You can also have event-based activity with alerts and notifications, because as content is born or acquired or analyzed, certain things come to light as soon as you know what it is. Like, oh, hey, there's sensitive data here, time to take action. Or there's harassment language in this content. So you can set, depending how sophisticated you want to get with your workflow, you start with an analysis of the content, and you can take all kinds of actions based on the findings of what that content is. One of which, of course, is migration. We're going to get into that in just a second. All right. So I'm going to use the larger term data in flight. Migration is a form of data in flight. So data in flight essentially means that data content is changing location from an original one to another. There are some reasons you would do that. It comes up all the time, like with an M&A, where one company is acquiring the assets, including the information of another, and it's corollary divestiture. So an organization is getting rid of or departing with its content. Sometimes it's just that it's moving, let's say, to the cloud or to another ECM or other repository. And what you find with data in flight is that it often has corporate attention. There is something that is precipitating that that takeoff, if you will. Either it's a whole bunch of layoffs, or it's an acquisition, or it's sunsetting a system. There's going to be monitoring strategic components to why this is happening. So that's a really good moment, because a lot of you folks, when I go out there and I talk in person, you come to me afterwards and you're like, yeah, well, how do I get the budget? How do I build the ROI? Here's how, okay? When you have data in flight, there's going to be corporate attention being paid. That means there's going to be budgets and kind of corporate oversight and approval. All right, those are kind of the key ingredients to getting a project off the ground. So here's a specific ROI, and we've mentioned this before. Now you'll really see it come up, which is start with a compelling use case. ROT is probably the most compelling for all the reasons we just said. Number one, all those storage costs. You will instantly earn an ROI, probably a 10x ROI, just by removing ROT. That is going to pay for systems like this, frankly, 10 times over, and you get all the other benefits along the way merely from the cost savings on ROT. The rest of this I've kind of covered before, but basically once you have a compelling use case, and I'm telling you ROT is it, everything else is gravy. The ROI will already be there. So all those pet projects you want to do, like classify all the content in that drive, or automate the retention policy across the board, watch for data in flight as your moment. Come forward with a ROT removal, a ROT remediation proposal. You will be able to get that through. All right. So now let's talk about the wrong way and the right way. And I absolutely loved this picture because it is what most people do when they migrate, let's say, to the cloud or up into Office 365 or what have you, which is they literally lift and shift.
That's every single merger and acquisition I've ever seen right there in that picture.
Right there. Okay. And this is, let's be clear, this is not best practice. We are not advocating this. This is the baby and the bathwater. And the metaphor that I use all the time that you guys can feel free to take with you is, if you change homes, if you're moving from one house to another, or an apartment to a house or what have you, yes, you take all your furniture and all your stuff, but you do empty the garbage pail before you bring it from one bathroom to the other bathroom. You don't take the garbage in the garbage pail and bring it to the new house. And that garbage, that metaphor, that's the ROT in your organization. So if you're going to take content from one location and move it to another, use that moment as a cleanup period to say, let's get this classified and organized and get the ROT out before we migrate. The other big thing, and I just want to kind of, maybe we'll do another presentation one day all about SharePoint. Another big thing I want to mention is that when you do auto classification properly, you're not just determining ROT, you're determining 20, 30, 50 attributes about that content. All of that becomes metadata, and if you're using SharePoint or a sophisticated repository, that information is accessible to your new location. You don't have to just use folder structure or taxonomy as your sole mechanism for finding data. If you do your content analysis correctly, all of those little data tags can be available in SharePoint, and you can stop with the folder structure nonsense, the Mike's folder that Nick mentioned. This is a big mistake, is people just literally replicating what they had on the file share in SharePoint. Don't do this. The last two are the kind of stop fooling yourself about who people are and what they do. People will be bad actors, and so don't just provide broad access. Today's tools can federate security up and down the line, and there's no reason to just say, well, here's your data, everybody's in it. It should be more granular than that. It should be content driven. And then lastly, telling people to keep their data clean is all well and good, but we're back to that top down, bottom up. This is not a strategy. This is just kind of advice. All right, so then how do we do it properly? First of all, understand what kind of migration you have. Is data coming into or out of your organization? Are you changing platforms? And is this your moment to institute IG? If it is, stop, slow down, and put the steps in place. I strongly recommend that you stream the migration. In other words, don't just lift and shift in a giant batch. Makes much smaller. And if you can do it, again, a good auto classification system will do this for you. Do it file by file. As it's being analyzed, immediately send it off to its new home. Obviously, use tools. Make sure you validate your before and after, that nothing got lost or corrupted or whatnot. And ensure continuous monitoring. This doesn't mean that you have to stick your eyeballs on it, but put systems in place that are both monitoring the process and monitoring the results immediately after migration and over time. Nick, it looks like you had something you wanted to say.
Oh, you can continue.
Okay. And I got the 5-minute warning. We are almost done. So just a couple of tips and techniques for you all. Recognize that migration is almost always going to start a discussion around corporate culture, and there is going to be a culture change because we need to get out of this notion of store everything and into store what's required or essential. And if people can't make the decision, then we'll put in place systems that can. Another one that you can do, you can enact right away just with your own behavior. Stop emailing files around. Start sending links instead. The file you want is located here. And that will cut down on rot and cut down on the zillions of forensically identical copies. Use shortcuts, links, and tombstones. They look and feel exactly like the real deal. They just don't take up all the space and there isn't all this file clutter. IT will be on board with you because the more space you free up, the less they have to manage. And then legal and records will also be on place with you, again, depending who you are, because this is calling for a plan to handle content lifecycle management. That was our second webinar. I strongly recommend you listen to that if you don't understand what I'm saying. But basically put into place policies that dictate and monitor, that's important, the passage of time in relation to content. And once you have that, ensure that your tools can enact that for you. One last thing I'll leave you with is to anticipate the dovetailing of these issues. 2 webinars down the line, we're going to be talking about data privacy because legal hold and privacy are often at odds with each other. Privacy says do not keep this sensitive data. Legal hold says do keep it. And then legal hold and retention can be at odds, and then all 3 can be at odds. And there is a kind of triumvirate of warring factions going on. Who owns the content? Who trumps who in this? And what happens when, let's say, legal hold is over? Is anybody going back and dealing with that content? By and large, no. And of course, there's a giant source of rot all over again. So hopefully we've come full circle in our conversation today. This is a slide from before, so I'll just go quickly, which is that, of course, all of these are interrelated. Today we spoke about migration upgrades. We've hit at least 4 or 5 on here. And you see how dovetailed and interconnected they are. And I'm looking to see if we have any questions. Looks like no. And so I'm just going to leave you with, we're going to head this way too in our presentation, but basically data under management is the concept of having all of your content assessed and classified, using automation to do it the first time, and perpetually as new content is born, as circumstances and content and regulations change, and evergreen throughout the life cycle of it. That pretty much concludes our webinar today, right on time. I invite you all to come back on September 18th when we're going to talk about really managing by metadata. That's going to be a really exciting one. I'll open it up to questions if we have any. And if not, I will turn it over back to Nick. If you have any final thoughts.
I'd just be remiss if I didn't point folks to arma.org for additional resources. We have a lot of great resources that'll be coming out through the rest of the year to help you on topics like managing ROT, as well as mergers and acquisitions, which we've talked about here, and document management and capture as it relates to information governance and digital transformation. So a whole lot of additional resources coming out at arma.org, and I urge everyone to become a pro member.
All righty. Well, thanks everybody for attending the webinar today. Here's where to find more information about Valora. We will make this presentation available to all of you. And if there are questions that come up now or in the next few minutes, we will be happy to answer those in email. And you can, of course, reach out to Nick or to me anytime, and we'd be happy to direct you for more information.
And Sandy, thank you so much for the opportunity to share with the community. It's always a pleasure to do webinars with you.
Oh, thank you, Nick. It's always a pleasure on my end as well. So thank you for your time and your thoughts.